So a video in two parts, one to give you some feedback on the assessment that you did on the 6th of January, and two just as a reminder of how to approach this type of question. The question was, explore how Dickens uses the ghosts to help Scrooge change his attitudes and behaviour in the extract and in the novel as a whole. So what I would remind you is that when you're answering this question in the literature paper, you need to make sure that your response covers both parts of the question, that you're talking about the extract in enough detail and you're talking about the rest of the text in enough detail. Now, the balance doesn't have to be equal, but you might aim for 60-40, and that can be in favour of either side, the extract or the rest of the novel, depending on which you think can give you more examples and will allow you to show off more of your skills for the particular question that you're answering. So that might vary depending on the actual question. So here are some of the things that I thought you could have said about the extract, some of which you did say and some of which you missed. So one of the ways in which the ghosts, Marley's ghost, helps Scrooge to change is by creating fear in him. So we see that through the use of the word trembling, and the word trembling or trembled is repeated later on. So we know that he's really scared. So one of the ways that we try to change Scrooge is by making him fearful. We see that has had an effect in the extract because we see an immediate contrast in Scrooge when he begins to show curiosity. He asks, "Tell me why." And that's very different from the very closed oyster, the simile that we saw him described as in the opening pages of the book, and the very dismissive attitude that he shows towards Fred when he says humbug and tries to shut Fred's protestations down. So we immediately see that Scrooge has changed somewhat, although obviously he fluctuates backwards and forwards in terms of his progress in his change. One of the other methods that Dickens uses is by Marley's ghosts giving Scrooge an uncompromising message. So Scrooge asks for comfort and he's told by Marley, "I have none." Therefore, the effect of this is that Scrooge can't escape the realisation of the awful fate that might be waiting for him. And that means that hopefully he will begin to change because he sees how hideous this might be. Another method is that Marley's ghost is used by Dickens to show Scrooge that if he doesn't change his way, he's going to lose all of the freedoms that he enjoys in his life at the moment. So he's going to be chained and punished. So the ghosts are trying to help Marley escape hell. But if Scrooge doesn't change, like Marley, he will have little permitted freedom. So he's going to be very, very restricted in the afterlife. And of course, because this was Victorian England, people did believe in the afterlife, and therefore that's a very effective way of trying to get Scrooge to realise that what he does on earth is going to have a consequence for the afterlife. The extract also shows us that Scrooge immediately becomes thoughtful. So at the end, it says he's pondering on what the ghost has said. So he's considering Marley's message. At that moment, though, we don't really know exactly what he's considering. Is he considering his way of getting out of it, or is he considering that he needs to change? We don't know yet. It's too early to say. You might vary. You might say something about the extract and then say something about how this relates to how the other ghosts also try to persuade him to change. Or you might say everything that you can about the extract and then everything you can about the rest of the text. That second version of answering the question is a little more dangerous, because if you managed your time wrongly and you ran out of time, you wouldn't be able to have the balance in answering the question that I talked about at the beginning. So actually, it's probably better to say some things about the extract and then move on to the rest of the text and then go back to the extract and then back to the rest of the text, so that you're showing that you've got control and knowledge over the whole of the text, which is what's going to get you higher grades. So here are some of the things that you could say about the other ghosts. Now, when we did this assessment on the 6th of January, we had only covered the Ghost of Christmas Past. So you could have only written about the Ghost of Christmas Past in detail, and that's what you should have done. Obviously, as we read the rest of the book, you'll be able to add more information about the rest of the ghosts, but I'm only going to talk about the Ghost of Christmas Past. So the Ghost of Christmas Past helps Scrooge change by the very way that he looks. So he represents the light of realization and revelation and the positive memories that Scrooge has buried. So that's one of Dickens's methodologies in helping Scrooge to change. It's just the very way that the Ghost of Christmas Past looks. So the fact that the Ghost of Christmas Past is represented as an innocent and pure being might help to ensure that Scrooge is less resistant to him. So he's described as having white hair, and we have those positive associations with the colour white, and that he's got a lustrous belt, so he's associated with lightness or light, which is also associated with revelation and seeing things. He's also kind, and the word that's used to describe him is tender, which means that Scrooge might not automatically be repelled by him as he might have been by the horror and pain of what Marley represented. So that's another one of Dickens's methodologies. The fluctuation of the light and the clarity in which the ghost is presented, so he flickers in and out of view, he's not always clearly seen, is used to represent the fluctuation of Scrooge's willingness to accept the messages that has been given at this point. He begged him to be covered at one point, for example. So he's actually, at this point, we're shown that he's not ready to receive all of the messages that he's been given. And that means that at various different times, this ghost needs to be more insistent. So sometimes he becomes more insistent to overcome Scrooge's lack of willingness. The Ghost of Christmas Past helps Scrooge to begin to change by ensuring that he begins to show emotions which have been buried for so long. So he asks him, "What's that upon your cheek?" when Scrooge begins to cry. Scrooge isn't ready to acknowledge those emotions at this point. He calls it a pimple, so he sort of moves away from acknowledging his emotions, but it is a move forward because he's not the closed-up oyster that we talked about at the beginning of the text. The Ghost of Christmas Past reminds Scrooge of the pleasures that Scrooge used to take in life. By taking him on a journey to his past, he shows that Scrooge used to take pleasure and used to enjoy things about life. So he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them. So he's reminded of the positive way that he used to feel about some things. Scrooge is also forced by the Ghost of Christmas Past to acknowledge the love that he felt for his sister, and through this he begins to feel guilty about the way that he's neglected Fred, so he realises that he's really made some mistakes, and he begins to feel regret and a sense of loss. He seemed to feel uneasy in his mind, it says in the text. So we know that he's beginning to reassess the way that he's behaved. The Ghost of Christmas Past also uses Fezziwig as an example of how an employer could behave towards both community and employees, and makes Scrooge realise that actually he wouldn't lose anything by being warmer or more compassionate to those who have less than him, and therefore he remembers the good demonstration that Fezziwig gave to him as he was his employee. And by showing Scrooge how he used to love Belle and how his behaviour resulted in the loss of her, Scrooge is forced to acknowledge the happiness that he could have had in his life and to realise that money is of far less importance than love and family. So he's shown these things as an illustration so that he can begin to overcome his habitual resistance to all of the positivities that life has to offer. So those are just some of the things that you could have written about. You struggled a bit because I think you thought that it was a lot more difficult than it was, but it's not rocket science. All of the literature questions are basically asking you to be able to do the same thing. They're asking you to answer the question and to make sure that you answer the question in all of its parts in order to get high marks. They're asking you to give specific details about the writer's methods and explain how they're relevant to the question that you're answering, and explain how they do the thing that you're claiming that they do. So you've got to be very clear about it rather than just make a claim and not back it up. They're asking you to range across the text, whether it's a poem or a novel. Don't limit yourself to one or two small parts. You can say a lot about a small amount, but you need to be able to show that you've got a handle on all of the text. So you need to know the text well, and I think you've suffered because you don't go back to your text enough. So we saw that in the mock, and we saw that in this assessment as well. You need to be able to explain what you believe the writer's intended effects are through the techniques that they use. Now, in the lesson now, we are going to try and apply some of these things to the assessments. I'm going to give you back your assessment and you're going to add to it.